The storm wasn't just weather that night. It was judgment. The mountains below were knives of ice, waiting to carve the sky apart. Inside Falcon 9, breath fogged against the red glow of emergency lights, and someone whispered a prayer they didn't believe in. Then came the order. Cold. Final. Drop her. The words slid through the cabin like a verdict no one wanted to own. They didn't look at her when they grabbed her vest, just eyes locked forward, pretending the war made this normal. Her scream was swallowed by the roar of rotors and thunder, and then she was gone, flung into the dark like a secret no one would ever admit existed. Now, before we uncover the final classified log from the Falcon 9 crash, hit that like button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because somewhere out there, maybe closer than we think, the legend of the Ranger who never hit the ground is still being written. They said no one could survive that fall. No one ever does. But hours later, in a valley that shouldn't have echoes, a distress signal pulsed once, then twice, from coordinates that no longer existed on the map. The military called it interference. Locals called it a ghost frequency. And deep inside a classified transcript buried under layers of redaction, one phrase appears again and again. Rangers don't need parachutes. They say the human body reaches terminal velocity at 120 miles per hour, but no one ever talks about what happens after, when the body stops falling and the soul keeps going. They said she fell clean through the clouds that night. No shoot, no flare, no scream loud enough to register over the engine's death rattle. The men inside the helicopter swore they didn't look down. They swore the wind was too loud, that they didn't hear the impact, that maybe there wasn't one at all. But the radio didn't stop humming. At first it was just static, that kind of white noise that makes your ears ring like memory. Then came a single voice, hers. The same tone, the same call sign, whispering coordinates that didn't exist on any map. The logs say Falcon 9 lost telemetry for 17 seconds. Just gone, like someone edited reality with a dull blade. When the feed came back, the altimeter was still ticking, the cabin lights flickering like a heartbeat, but her seatbelt was empty. No debris, no blood, just the faint smell of ozone and burned nylon. They told command she was gone. They filed it as incident unrecoverable. But the truth didn't stay buried, because hours later, deep in the Afghan valley, a motion sensor picked up movement. Small, deliberate, human. Footprints. Bare. 2 kilometers from the drop zone. The men who threw her never spoke of it again. One transferred stateside, started drinking. Another went off-grid entirely. But every few months, someone in that unit gets a call at night. The number is blocked. The line opens with silence, and then a soft inhale, like the breath you take before a jump. Then she says their names. Not rank, not code, just names, one by one. The analysts try to trace it, said it was a glitch. But you can't trace a voice that's not supposed to exist. In the archive debriefs, there's a phrase scribbled in the margin, half erased by black ink. Rangers don't need parachutes. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe it was something darker, something they tested and buried under classified. Because every time that phrase shows up in the files, there's a redaction block beside it, like someone didn't want the context surviving. And if you listen close enough to those tapes, you can still hear her fall. The rush of wind, the rising static, the world holding its breath for 17 seconds before pretending nothing ever happened. But the men who were there know better. The fall never ended. It's still happening, somewhere between gravity and guilt. It began with static again, thin, hungry static that crawled under the skin like memory. At 3:17, the frequency split open, and a voice slipped through the noise. Calm, controlled, identifiable. Lieutenant McKinley. But she'd been buried 3 days earlier under a flag and a silence the army wears like perfume. The transmission was brief, 6 seconds, maybe less. A breath, a heartbeat, a half-formed word, then nothing. Analysts called it bleed through, the ghost of a previous signal bouncing off the ionosphere. But someone in comms replayed the tape at half speed and swore they heard her inhale, slow, deliberate, alive. The official report lists the audio as corrupted, later destroyed, due to electromagnetic degradation. But fragments don't degrade like that. They vanish when someone wants them gone. A FOIA document buried in a sea of redactions links that same timestamp to an ELF communications test, the kind of frequency that can travel through mountains, through oceans, through whatever separates the living from the dead. What the file doesn't explain is why her old call sign was authorized for transmission in that sector, or why her clearance code had been reactivated 48 hours after her death. In the days that followed, the signal came back. Each night, the coordinates changed, spiraling outward, tracing a pattern across the terrain like a message drawn in geometry only machines could understand. The analysts dismissed it as interference. But one soldier, Corporal Reyes, mapped the points by hand, and realized they formed a perfect Fibonacci spiral centered on the crash site. When he presented it to his CO, the map was confiscated. Reyes went AWOL 2 days later. His last text to another ranger was 3 words: "She's still moving." Somewhere online, the story leaked. A post buried deep in an old Ranger forum mentioned Operation Phoenix Wing, a rumored psychic recon program designed to retrieve intel from downed operatives after the body stopped responding. The post was deleted within an hour, the account scrubbed, but screenshots survive. They always do. In those screenshots, a user claims the project involved neural echo tracing, the attempt to anchor a soldier's consciousness to long-range communication frequencies, to make the mind outlive the mission. And now, every few nights, somewhere in the dead hours before dawn, the same pulse ripples through NATO comms. Always faint, always female, always followed by a silence that feels too intentional to be empty. No one can trace it. No one admits to listening anymore. But the men who were on that helicopter, they know the pattern by heart. They say it's her voice, closer each time. The signal's no longer drifting. It's hunting its way home. It started as a rumor whispered in the margins of declassified pages, an Air Force project with no budget trail, no official insignia, and a name that sounded like a prayer: Phoenix Wing. The documents that survive call it a Parachute Performance Enhancement Initiative, but the language is all wrong. The terminology isn't military. It's anatomical, neural, almost devotional. Vestibular recalibration, somatic trust, cortical adaptation to terminal velocity. Words that read less like a flight test and more like the blueprint of a resurrection. Buried memos from 1987 describe human subjects exposed to prolonged freefall simulation without gear. Some were placed in zero-gravity chambers, others suspended for hours in rotating harnesses, their minds tricked into believing they were falling endlessly through air. Electrodes mapped their panic, their surrender, their strange adaptation to terror. One scientist, Dr. Alara Morton, wrote that fear is a reflex that can be unlearned. She disappeared 6 months later, leaving behind a single message in a corrupted email draft. The body remembers air resistance even when air is gone. There are recordings too, if you know where to look. Grainy analog tapes of shadowed figures stepping from aircraft without visible rigs. No countdown, no communication, just a long, silent fall into cloud cover. Every clip cuts before impact, as if whoever filmed them couldn't bear to see what came next, or knew there was nothing to see at all. In one tape, slowed down frame by frame, a figure seems to twist mid-descent, limbs moving against the pull of gravity, as though swimming upward through invisible current. The footage ends abruptly with the words, "Training complete." What if Phoenix Wing wasn't about surviving the fall, but mastering, reprogramming the brain to interpret impact not as death, but transition? Some conspiracy theorists claim the program birthed the first kinetic memory operatives, soldiers conditioned to reawaken post-impact, their senses aligned to a kind of second life. The few records that hint at success describe the subject's heart stopping mid-descent, only to restart seconds later. Impossible, beautiful, terrifying. And maybe that's what happened to her. Maybe Lieutenant McKinley wasn't lucky. Maybe she was proof. A living experiment wearing dog tags instead of a name. The horror is in the awe of it. The notion that falling no longer meant dying. That she could have hit the earth and kept going. And somewhere, in the unlit corners of military history, there's a file stamped Phoenix Wing, active. They said the snow still carried her shape. Months had passed since the crash, yet when the rescue team traced the ridgeline, the tracks looked fresh, bare feet, spaced unevenly, blood frozen into the white. They circled the blackened wreck like a ritual, like someone returning to something sacred or forbidden. The men who followed the prints didn't speak, not out loud. They said the silence up there was different, thick, charged, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. And when the medevac pilot reported seeing her, standing straight-backed in torn fatigues, one arm raised in a perfect salute, every man on that radio fell quiet. Because she'd been buried months before. Arlington, full honors, closed casket. When the team reached the ridge, she was gone. No sign of struggle, no drag marks, only an insignia pressed into the snow. RLTW, Rangers lead the way. But the design didn't match any known patch. The thread count, the curvature of the lettering, even the fabric fiber matched nothing in the archives. It was newer, or older, or something no one had authorized. JSOC reports mention unauthorized field sightings. Locals whisper of a ghost soldier, a woman who wanders the mountain at dusk, moving without sound, her breath clouding the air like smoke from the crash that never stopped burning. Medical teams were dispatched under the guise of environmental contamination study. What they found in the soil and snow wasn't contamination. It was cortisol, adrenaline, levels that should have burned through a human body in minutes. Samples were sent to a lab in Virginia and sealed under a designation reserved for bioweapons research. Someone wanted her physiology classified. Someone wanted her survival to look like an infection. Then came the rifle, unregistered, scorched, serial number linked to an operative listed, missing during Phoenix Wing evaluation. The brass tried to bury that connection, but digital sleuths caught it, cross-referencing blacklisted armory logs and leaked contractor manifests. The number matched a prototype weapon issued to test subjects. Firearms built to record biometrics through their grips, meaning someone, somewhere, was still collecting her pulse. And that's when the guilt began to bloom. The men who left her, who watched her fall, started hearing clicks in their comms. Breathing, static layered beneath their transmissions, just enough to sound human. One claimed his night vision flickered to show a figure watching from the tree line before vanishing. Another said he woke to the smell of burned aviation fuel and wet pine. They told themselves it was trauma, memory, guilt playing tricks, but deep down, they knew what it was. She hadn't died. She hadn't disappeared. She'd come back to remind them that Rangers never fall alone. They call it myth now. Easier that way. Easier to archive a miracle than explain it. In the cold hum of Pentagon corridors, her name is redacted under phrases like psychological contagion, collective stress disorder, or the most convenient of all, fabricated morale symbol. But no amount of paperwork can smother what moves between soldiers in the small hours before dawn. The whispers are always the same. When a Ranger falls alone, the ground hesitates. Some say it's her. Others say it's what she became. Something between flesh and faith. Anonymous notes, stamped with obsolete clearance codes, began circulating through encrypted channels last year. They spoke of a female operator extracted under falsified death conditions. No further data. No signature. Just one attached phrase. Project Rebirth complete. Deep web footage soon followed. A blurry figure on thermal skin moving through the ruins of Marja. The body temperature wrong for a living person, yet too steady for a ghost. The clip vanishes minutes after upload. Every mirror account is deleted in sequence, as if the algorithm itself knows her face. Even now, the original Falcon 9 coordinates are sealed, redacted under 7 layers of operational security. And yet every January, someone drives there. Tracks in the snow, cigarette ash, a small Ranger patch pinned to a branch facing east. Whoever goes, they never speak. They don't need to. The story's alive without them. It circulates through barracks and break rooms, through message boards that vanish overnight. Every time someone posts the phrase Falcon 9 survivor, it's gone before the next refresh. Like the servers are haunted too. Psychologists call it collective grief taking form. The Pentagon calls it morale mythology. But on the ground, among the ones who still hear static in the silence after missions, she's not a symbol. She's proof. Proof that courage doesn't fade. It mutates. Becomes something you can't kill, can't bury, can't classify. Some nights, when the wind drops low and the comms go quiet, they say you can feel it. A delay between heartbeat and echo. A breath that isn't yours. That's her legacy. The fall that never ended. The Ranger who taught the earth to hold its breath.